Not much traffic on the river today. When I was younger, there were all sorts of boats plying the trade up and down this stretch of water. Lots of them used to stop just there. That's the tile yard where I worked all my life, as did my dad and my grandfather too. It's one of the few yards left along this stretch of the river now. But in my day, there were at least 7 yards in Barton alone. You see, it's because there's such a good lot of clay in the ground along this bit of river. That's why the industry took off so well. This is where they're digging the clay out, and it's taken up in long trenches that fill up with water. Nowadays, of course, you can scoop it all up with a great big JCB. It comes up with a bucket full, and it gets loaded onto a little hopper along them rails. And the engine pulls it right along the track and up into the mill. We didn't have it so easy, I can tell you. We had to provide all our own tools to do the job with, and we looked after them and all, because we had to pay for them ourselves. This is what we looked like in my dad's day. There was no machinery back then, we had to dig it all out by hand. After the topsoil was shifted off, a gang of us would start to dig the clay out. And we'd dig along in like terraces, and it was hard, muddy, slippery work. And we lay planking down to push the barrows along when they were full of clay. These are some of the tools you had to use for digging out the clay. This one's called a gouge, and we used it to dig the clay out. We'd dig along one gouge deep and another gouge wide and go right along to the end, and then come back again and go down another gouge deep, and so on. Each one of us had a dip bucket. This was filled with water, and you dip the gouge in so you could cut through the clay nice and easy without getting all clarted up. This one's called a crummer, and when we was digging the clay, or making tiles for that matter, nothing was wasted. So if a bit or a crumb fell off the end of the gouge, you'd scoop it up with this. No, as I say, believe you me, nothing was wasted. And my dad would come down on me like a ton of bricks if he thought I'd been less than thrifty with the clay. When we had a barrow full of clay, we'd wheel it along the planking very carefully, because it was only about 4 inches wide and very slippery, or slape as we used to call it. You know, like, watch out Fred, it's right slape just here. And then we'd go along so far, and then a mate would meet you about halfway with an empty barrow. And he'd take your full one off to the mill, and you'd take his empty one, and you'd start all over again, filling up with clay. We did this right through the winter too. Sometimes you had to scrape the snow off the clay just to dig it. And when the weather was really bad, the clay pits would start filling up with water almost as fast as you could take it out. So you could imagine just what sort of a state we were in when we'd finished. When I was newly married, woe betide me if I tracked clay right through the house. I practically had to get undressed outside. Anyway, the cut clay was stacked nice and neatly near the mill for a couple of weeks to weather. You can't make tiles out of newly cut clay, of course. The texture's all wrong. Some clay's wetter than others, or more lumpy. So you had to mix it so that it was smooth and even. This was done by a milling machine. When I first started work, it was operated by hand. There was a big wooden cylinder and a tapered end and a screw which went right through the middle, a bit like a giant corkscrew. And when you turned the handle and the screw went round and round, the clay was mixed and it was forced right through to the tapered end. And it would come out here. And as one man turned the handle, another would cut the mixed and compressed clay off into dowels at the end of the machine. He used a piece of wire, a bit like a cheese cutter. These dowels was about 2 foot long and 1 foot square, exactly the same as these. And each one of them weighed about 2 stones, so the cutting and stacking was quite hard work. And we'd stack them into piles again, but this time we'd put a bit of sand over each layer to stop them sticking together. And then we'd leave them for about another couple of days or so before they were ready to be made into tiles. After that, we'd have to lug the dowels around in a barrow again, this time to the drying sheds. Sometimes you felt like you spent the whole day pushing barrow loads of clay around the site, and if you were clumsy enough to tip 1 hour, your mates would give you a right leg pulling about it. These drying sheds were long buildings with a door at each end and shutters alongside that you can open or close depending what the weather was like. And in mine and my dad's day, these drying sheds took up most of the room on site, and they were absolutely full of tiles when we was making. And in the drying shed, there was another machine on wheels that you'd load the dowels into. And just like the mixer, when you turned the handle, the clay was forced right down to the end. And it was squeezed out through a die. That's the thing that makes the shape of the tiles, like toothpaste coming out of a tube. And we'd fasten different dies onto the end of the machine, depending what shape of tiles we was making. The inside bit of the die is made of brass, and as the clay was forced through, it would come out the other side in the shape of a tile. One fella would turn the handle of the tile, and the other would cut the tiles as they came out the other end. We used the cheese wire again, and a special little lever which made a nib on each of the tiles so that they'd lock together when you put them on a roof. We'd lift the tiles off with a wooden paddle called a horse. So you had to be quick and careful, and there was no room for lack of concentration. But you soon got into the rhythm of cutting and nibbing and lifting. And we took such pride in our work that we used to press our initials into the tiles. I still get a real kick when I think of how many buildings there are around today with my initials on the roof tiles. And even after having had to do all those jobs at once, a man could still cut and stack 2,000 tiles in a day.